Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geneviève Brown, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's webinar. Alors, bon après-midi, bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle Geneviève Brown, je suis la directrice exécutive de la division du financement novateur et je suis heureuse de vous accueillir aujourd'hui à ce webinaire. C'est un vrai plaisir pour moi de lancer cette discussion importante sur le commerce inclusif et le rôle des peuples autochtones en tant que détenteurs de droits dans l'élaboration de nos politiques commerciales. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that for those of us in Ottawa, we are gathered here on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, whose presence here reaches back to time immemorial. I want to also recognize that we live by the Mississippi, the Big River. It's a vital transportation route for trade and travel, as well as a gathering place for celebration for the Algonquin people for thousands of years. La colonisation a rendu plus difficile notre compréhension de l'histoire des peuples autochtones en tant qu'experts commerçants et premiers gardiens de la terre et de nos sources d'eau. Notre conversation d'aujourd'hui vise à, en partie, combler ce manque de compréhension. Donc, pour ceux qui se joignent à nous depuis ailleurs, je vous encourage à prendre un moment de reconnaître la terre sur laquelle vous vous trouvez et ses gardiens. I'd like to also recognize that this conversation would not be possible without the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development, EDM, the people on this project, implemented by Cowater and the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. So since its launch in 2018, the EDM has facilitated over 450 deployments of technical experts, helping our country partners negotiate, implement, and benefit from trade investment agreements with Canada. Avec plus de 110 activités d'assistance technique dans 9 pays et dans le bloc asien, le projet EDM a contribué à renforcer les capacités institutionnelles des gouvernements, du secteur privé et des organisations de la société civile, à promouvoir l'égalité des genres et à soutenir les groupes sous-représentés, notamment les femmes, mais les PME et les communautés autochtones. The project's impact is tangible. In the past year, roughly 1,500 government officials, more than half of them women, have strengthened their skills in trade negotiation and implementation. This has led to the adoption of more ambitious provisions in trade agreements, including on gender, labor, and the environment. It has also improved the implementation of agreements, the mutual benefit of our country partners in Canada. This is not negligible, and it comes out often as one of the key benefits of this project. Thanks to EDM support, we are seeing progress in fostering inclusive trade policies, with the expected positive returns, of course, on income and employment. Cowater has been instrumental in pushing the EDM forward, working closely with colleagues across the development and trade teams at Global Affairs Canada. Grâce au rôle de Cowater dans le projet, le webinaire d'aujourd'hui marque une autre étape importante dans le lancement d'un document d'orientation sur la façon dont les accords de libre-échange peuvent mieux soutenir les peuples autochtones. Ce document, élaboré dans le cadre du projet EDM, offre un regard opportun et réfléchi sur la façon dont les accords commerciaux commencent à reconnaître les droits des peuples autochtones, à protéger les connaissances traditionnelles et à promouvoir l'inclusion économique. This is more than a technical discussion. It's a chance to reflect on how trade can be a tool for reconciliation, empowerment, and shared economic growth. I encourage everyone to engage deeply with the insights presented today and to consider how we can continue to advance an inclusive approach to trade and development objectives. Quickly on housekeeping, this session will be recorded. That has begun already. Et pour ce qui est du pratique, la session sera enregistrée. Le webinaire se déroulera principalement en anglais, mais pendant la session de questions-réponses qui suivra la présentation et la discussion du panel, n'hésitez pas à poser des questions ou à partager vos commentaires dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Thank you for being here today, and I look forward to what awaits. So over to you, Nadia.
Merci beaucoup, Geneviève. Bonjour tout le monde, good afternoon, and perhaps good evening for those joining online from other parts of the world. My name is Nadia Gersh, and I'm head of programs with Cowater International, and I have the privilege of leading a portfolio of Global Affairs Canada funded projects. We're honored to be co-hosting this webinar and to have an opportunity to contribute to actually share some of the work that we're doing through the Expert Deployment Mechanism for Trade and Development, EDM. And so perhaps just quickly for those who might not be familiar with Cowater International, we're Canada's largest international development firm. We have been implementing a large number of projects over the last 40 years across many sectors. But I have to say that trade, and in particular, initiatives at the nexus of trade and development has been and continues to be a cornerstone of our work. And this actually includes a number of initiatives in addition to EDM. Some of you may be familiar with the Canadian Trade and Investment Facility for Development project focused on Asia Pacific. The first project, which we recently started to implement in the focus on inclusive trade in DRC, Zambia, and Mozambique, both initiatives funded also by Global Affairs Canada, as well as other initiatives funded through the UK government on a global scale. We're here today to talk about EDM. And so we've started implementing EDM indeed since 2018 in partnership with the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, or IPAC. And so what does EDM do? It does link both Canada's trade and development objective, and it does so by directly supporting Canada's developing country trade agreement partners to negotiate, implement, and benefit from trade agreements. And so really in doing so, EDM seeks to have a social and economic impact on those countries, while also at the same time creating opportunities or new opportunities for businesses in Canada. And so EDM implements its work through technical assistance, and those technical assistance are provided by Canadian and non-Canadian experts who provide independent advice to the partner countries that are really tailored to their needs and the circumstances of every country. We are in the final year of EDM, and so while we continue to be very busy in terms of the technical assistance activities underway, we really wanted to focus this final year on lessons learned. And so building on almost 8 years of active implementation and sponsoring a number of policy papers that covers important matters and also contributes to the conversation about how international development assistance contributes to both Canada's trade and development objective, including its trade diversification strategy. So it's really in this context that we came to realize that there was very few information, material, analysis around the connection between Indigenous people and trade agreement. And so which led actually to this first policy paper on this important matter. So we're very excited to be presenting the findings of this first paper, which was co-authored by Sherry Stephenson and Mia Mikic, and who's going to touch on the really the implication of trade agreements, but more directly the connection of trade agreement in creating economic opportunities for Indigenous people while also protecting their rights and respecting their social and cultural framework. So with no further ado, I'm very happy to pass the floor to my colleague, Faith Rourke, EDM Project Director, who's going to introduce panelists.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Jean-Dev. We have a lot to do today, so we're going to get straight to it. We have things to talk about and to present. We have an audience participation component where there'll be hopefully lots of discussion. And at the end of it, what I hope to get as a takeaway is, as in this town, as everybody's trying to figure out what the priorities are of the government and how to address them, I'm going to turn to my friend and colleague, Don Stephenson, who used to have the job as Chief Trade Policy and Trade Negotiator, and say, okay, you've heard all this, Don. What's the 30-second pitch on how to bring this into the priorities and to influence what the Trade Minister and his office is thinking about? And how do we get Indigenous people's issues on the trade agenda of the government? We're going to start with an awesome presentation. Two co-authors are here. Sherry's right beside me, and Mia Mikic is online. Both are amazing experts in so many areas. It's a little too long to describe. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let you speak for yourselves, and you will see what I mean. So, Sherry, Mia, it's over to you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Phil. And we agreed that I will be starting. So I'm truly pleased to join you today, even if virtually. I wish I was there physically with you. Let me just say at the outset that for me, as for many of you around the table and in the room, in the virtual room, work on this topic is much more than an academic exercise. It goes to the heart of what inclusive trade should mean in practice. It is about ensuring that the benefits and opportunities of trade genuinely extend to those whose voices have been often missing from the table. I have greatly valued the collaboration with colleagues across this initiative, and I'm pleased to share some of the insights that emerged from our study. In my presentation today, I will provide an overview of the study, its key findings, and how policymakers and negotiators have approached these issues in recent free trade agreements, at least in those that we have examined. And then Sherry will do the heavy lifting, and she will go through the rest of the study. So may I have the next slide, please? This study began with a simple but powerful question. How are Indigenous peoples actually represented in modern trade agreements? How far have these agreements come in recognizing Indigenous peoples not as beneficiaries, but as partners and rights holders? Although Indigenous peoples have engaged in trade for thousands of years, often as a means of maintaining inter-communities or intergenerational relationships, modern trade regimes, whether multilateral or regional, bilateral, have largely overlooked their rights and interests. Today, nearly 80% of free trade agreements, FTAs, include some form of inclusiveness provision. Yet fewer than 10% of those agreements have explicit references to Indigenous peoples. I'll repeat that, fewer than 10%. This imbalance highlights the gap between the growing rhetoric of inclusivity and the limited recognition of Indigenous participation in practice. It also reinforces that Indigenous peoples themselves have long asserted nothing about us without us. And our study looks at how this principle is finally beginning to find its way into trade policy and agreement design. Next slide, please. So this study is, it's not humble to say that, but it's the first global systematic analysis of Indigenous specific provisions in free trade agreements. We looked at 36 FTAs negotiated between 2005 and 2025, over 2 decades, that explicitly mention Indigenous peoples or terms such as First Nations, Maori, traditional knowledge, biodiversity, or genetic resources. Our study fills a real gap in the literature. It complements new and upcoming work from the World Economic Forum, the International Trade Center, and the OECD, all pointing to the same conclusion. Indigenous trade is now an emerging frontier of inclusive trade policy and FTAs. But we in this study went a little bit further, mapping not only where such provisions appear, but also how they are designed, what they aim to achieve, and what is missing. May I have the next slide, please? So our methodology combined artificial intelligence-assisted and manual text analysis with direct insights from practitioners. We used the TINA database to identify the relevant FTAs and then conducted a rigorous review of trade agreements, the texts of trade agreements, annexes, and complementary sources such as WTO and other international databases to locate provisions referring to Indigenous peoples or related terms. Each identified provision was then analyzed along 3 dimensions: its location in the agreement or in the chapter, as it may be, its legal character, whether it is binding or just a soft law best endeavor standing, or any institutional follow-up, such as a committee or working group, and subsequent reporting. We then cross-checked our findings through interviews with Indigenous experts, trade negotiators, and other experts, and validated them through literature and peer reviews. This multi-layered approach grounded our findings in evidence and not in perceptions. So the next slide, please. To take sense of very different treaty styles of these 36 FTAs, we grouped them into 5 clusters. 12 were in European Union and EFTA styled agreements, 5 were Canada or US style, 7 came from the Pacific, mainly from New Zealand and Australia, 4 were plurilateral, combining both developing and developed country members, and 8 agreements were bilateral among developing countries only. So this structure allowed us to compare patterns across legal traditions as well as regions. And the analysis shows a clear message. Canada and New Zealand lead in integrating Indigenous specific provisions, while most other regions lag far behind. Next slide, please. So this slide just puts up the table of these clusters, and it is available in the publication as well. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to comment on that. May I just then ask the next slide, please? Thank you. So across these 36 agreements, we identified every Indigenous-related article, noting exactly where it sits in the agreement or the chapter, whether it is binding or not, and what institutional mechanisms, if any, accompanies it. This produced the first comprehensive comparative database of its kind. In total, the provisions were examined mostly mostly come from chapters on environment, intellectual property, SMEs, government procurement, sustainable development, and cooperation. And the full mapping is available in the annex tables of this publication. So each entry then was tracked back to its article number in the agreement, so the evidence can be verified. And this systematic mapping revealed not just inclusion in the agreement, but also the pattern, or helped us reveal the pattern and intent behind it. The next slide, please. So from this mapping, we identified 4 main approaches. First, the affirmative approach, which recognizes Indigenous rights or treaty obligations. Typical examples being references to the United Nations declarations on the rights of Indigenous peoples, or, for example, Treaty of Waitangi in New Zealand case. Second, the exclusionary approach, which protects Indigenous economic space through carve-outs or exemptions, like set-asides in procurement or the preservation of pre-existing treaty rights. Third, the protective approach, focusing on intellectual property, biodiversity, and environmental safeguards that prevent exploitation of traditional knowledge or land. And fourth, the opportunity-oriented approach, which promotes cooperation, training, and capacity building to help Indigenous entrepreneurs participate in trade and expand on that participation. Together, these create a typology that captures the diversity of policy intent. So I'll go now very briefly through each of these approaches. First, under the affirmative approach, Indigenous peoples are explicitly recognized as distinct rights holders. This includes references, as already noted, to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or clauses reaffirming historic treaties and constitutional protections. Such language acknowledges that Indigenous participation in trade must be grounded in rights, not in goodwill of policymakers. For instance, Canada and New Zealand both use treaty exemptions to ensure or constitutional exemptions that ensure Indigenous rights remain legally protected, even as market liberalization expands. This is the moral and legal foundation of inclusive trade. The next slide, please. The exclusionary approach operates more pragmatically. It establishes carve-outs, areas of policy space reserved to safeguard indigenous interests. Examples include procurement set-asides for indigenous businesses or exemptions that prevent the agreements from overriding existing indigenous treaties commitments. In effect, how these operate, they are defensive mechanisms. They don't create new opportunities, new business opportunities, but they stop existing rights from being eroded. And so in several agreements, including Canada, New Zealand, Australia, such carve-outs have become standard practice. The next slide, please, for protective approach. Thank you. So in this approach, we find addressing threats to indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and the environment. These provisions are found mainly in chapters on intellectual property, environment, and sustainable development. They aim to prevent biopiracy and misappropriation that happens often, and I think Sherry will also be talking about that. The cases where traditional medicines, plants, or cultural symbols are commercialized without consent or benefit sharing. While protection clauses are now common, very few go as far as guaranteeing that indigenous people share in the commercial gains. So this remains very much work in progress, and much more effort should be put into it. However, it does mark a crucial shift from recognition to safeguard. So the last approach, the next slide, it is looking actually a little bit forward because it is focusing on cooperation, training, and inclusion of indigenous enterprises, indigenous businesses in trade missions and export promotion, in opening of new markets and business opportunities. Several FTAs, again, mainly Canadian and New Zealand, provide for joint working groups, training programs, or dialogues to help indigenous SMEs access new markets. These are non-binding, of course, but potentially transformative. They treat indigenous peoples not just as protected groups, but as active economic actor within something, with something to offer in global trade and regional trade making. So the next slide, please. I'm sorry for this table, probably very hard to see, but we wanted to show really the balance across of these four approaches and the regions that we have looked at. And so it's very clear that, for example, Canada and New Zealand agreements include provisions in nearly every category that we looked at, while European Union and EFTA-style agreements tend to emphasize rights and environmental safeguards. And then developing country bilateral agreements still show very limited coverage, often only symbolic mentions. This tells us that inclusive trade, in particular in this area of indigenous trade, remains geographically uneven, strong where domestic institutions already value indigenous partnerships, and weak where they do not exist. The next slide, this is my last slide. Just to summarize very briefly what I have covered. So first of all, provisions relevant to indigenous peoples are growing in number, but they still appear in less than 10% of the free trade agreements that exist. They are uneven across regions and vary greatly in legal strength. Most remain soft law or best endeavor. They are scattered across chapters rather than consolidated in standalone chapters or sections. Indeed, only five regional trade agreements or worldwide include a dedicated indigenous chapter. Institutional follow-up is very weak. This is one of the weakest parts of what we have found in our study. And for example, Canada-Ukraine agreement is one of the few with a specific mechanism for oversight. So much more work should be done in that area. The standalone example of innovation in this area is the Indigenous Peoples Economic and Trade Cooperation Agreement, IPAC. It is a co-governance model between governments and indigenous peoples of the member countries that demonstrates inclusivity can be institutionalized even without binding provisions. So I hope in the panel later on and discussion, we may talk a little bit more about this model because it does deserve being advocated for much more than perhaps it is. So let me stop here. This, I hope, sets the stage for the next part of the presentation, where Sherry will look at how countries are turning or can turn these lessons into good practices and what that implies for the future negotiation strategies of Canada and other countries involved. So thank you very much. And Sherry, the mic is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Mia. Excellent. Already a lot of great ideas on the table. For those of you online, we're going to have if there are questions after Mia and Sherry's presentation on the paper, we're going to take a few questions and then we'll go to the panel. If you want to ask questions, please put them on the chat and we can take them from there. Sure, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today in person. Here in Ottawa, beautiful weather, beautiful city, and on screen. I first would like to recognize the foresight of the Government of Canada in according importance and priority to this issue, which has been overlooked in the area of international trade policy for a long time, and commend the leadership that Canada has shown in the international trade community in this regard. And also to say what a pleasure it has been for Mia and me to work with Vicky and Phil and Don and all the EDM Cowater team on this initiative. So Mia has started us off with an excellent presentation of the background to our study, what we investigated and how we went about it and our main findings. So now I would like to take you with me to step back a little bit and provide some more insights into the rationale for the study from the perspective of Indigenous peoples. But to do this, it's important to understand how the issue of trade and especially trade agreements have been perceived by the Indigenous community so we can better appreciate their views and in what ways trade agreements can try to do better by them. Slide 7, there we are. So as we know, Indigenous peoples have engaged in trade for thousands of years, primarily within their own communities. But they did not experience and have not experienced for very long trade in the formal structure of our modern trade agreements, which are legally binding treaties. And exposure to these treaties and legal frameworks has impacted them in various ways and created several concerns on their part. So the study identifies and documents these Indigenous concerns. 5 main areas are highlighted where problems and issues have arisen, with concrete examples underneath each. First, Indigenous peoples have at times experienced negative outcomes from trade agreements, primarily through the exploitation of Indigenous lands without their consent. We know, all of us, cases of mining and extraction, examples, and resulting environmental destruction. Second, Indigenous peoples have experienced negative effects of trade through the pirating of their traditional knowledge, as Mia mentioned, on international markets for the gain of private companies or private actors who have used their knowledge and genetic resources through biopiracy without their consent and with the loss of benefits. Third, it has been challenging for Indigenous peoples to try and expand their traditional structure inter-Indigenous trade and investment beyond historical patterns and networks. And this is due to the unfamiliarity of the legal framework of trade agreements, as well as to challenges they face to access international markets within these frameworks. Next slide, please. Fourth, Indigenous peoples have felt disenfranchised by the lack of consultation in developing trade provisions that affect their communities directly. And this has been a violation of the principle of nothing about us without us, the drafting of trade policy positions and priorities without their involvement. Fifth, the provisions on capacity building that have been included in trade agreements to date have been felt to be inadequate by Indigenous peoples because of their lack of significant results. This is due to the fact that they have not been very precisely crafted, and most of these have been non-binding in nature, which has meant the failure to implement much of these good intention clauses. So I'd just like to note in this regard that the concerns we identified in the literature and documented in section 4 of the study matched almost exactly those that were shared with us by the trade policy experts and the representatives of Indigenous peoples in the 16 interviews that we carried out, which are documented in section 10. So next slide, please. So with this background in mind, we asked, how have the trade agreements examined in the study dealt with these concerns? Has there been any progress? And have trade agreements achieved anything so far or made any difference? Now, to really answer this question in a very concrete way, we need to identify impacts. But for that, it's necessary to carry out an assessment or an empirical estimate of the economic impact that the relevant trade provisions have had on Indigenous peoples. However, unfortunately, such an impact assessment is not possible to carry out at present for two reasons. The first is the lack of disaggregated data, statistical data on Indigenous economic activities and businesses and Indigenous trade. There are no disaggregated categories that give us this information. The second reason is the recent nature of many of these provisions, with numerous relevant trade agreements only having entered into force within the last 2 or 3 years, or still pending implementation in 3 cases. So we were forced to opt for other means of assessment and other indicators of progress. And as Mia said, our method combined analysis with shared experience from practitioners. And though this is not ideal, it nonetheless allowed us to obtain some important insights, which I'll share with you now. Next slide, please. We were able to identify a few which we think are important indicators of progress to date. Keep in mind that this is starting from a very low base. Effectively 20 years ago, there were almost no mentions, or perhaps even none at all, or references to Indigenous peoples in any trade agreement. But this has changed significantly over the past 2 decades, and particularly over the past 5 years. So in examining the content of the 36 relevant free trade agreements we identified with provisions that referenced Indigenous peoples and concerns, we noted several indicators of recent progress. The first one is a significant increase in the frequency of references to Indigenous peoples from nearly none in 2005 to 186 in total identified in the trade agreements we examined. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes. We did a distribution analysis of these 186 references and found that most of them are located in just 5 chapters, as shown in this spiderweb figure. These are the intellectual property chapters, which really are the lion's share of this attention, with over 40%. The various mentions of exceptions and carve-outs, the environment chapters, the investment chapters, and the trade and sustainable development chapters. So these 5 chapters are where most of the attention and provisions relevant to Indigenous peoples have been placed. Next slide, please. Second, those provisions of a binding character out of these 186 is not insignificant, numbering around 55 or 30% of the total. This means that nearly 1/3 of these provisions are actually obligatory to implement. But of course, the caveat here is that it is very true that the impact of these binding provisions will depend very much upon what they cover and how much economic value they will bring in their implementation. So third, we found that the institutional mechanisms to oversee and implement commitments relevant to Indigenous peoples are associated with 43 of these 186 relevant provisions. That's important because this means that there is a continuity in monitoring and oversight of the provisions that are included. However, as Mia said, we found that unfortunately there is a lack of information about any of this monitoring or oversight that is actually taken place. So the intention to do it and commitment is there, but the actual carrying through is work in progress. Fourth, very importantly, governments have begun to engage Indigenous peoples in the development of trade policy itself on matters affecting their interests. And this is really important because it has been obviously a longstanding request. And to date, it has been acted upon primarily in Canada, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Chinese Taipei in various ways, which I will go through a little bit later. So, and lastly, fifth, for the first time, mutually executed capacity building initiatives have been carried out with increased government support. So this is also really significant because when such activities are mutually agreed, they can obviously better reflect Indigenous priorities and thus much more effectively transmit the knowledge and skills that we want to be and helpful to pass on. So these are all positive things that we've been able to identify. But the caveat here is that despite the progress overall, the content of the FTAs, as Mia said, at present is still very uneven. Canada and New Zealand stand out as leaders. In this regard, they have established best practices both through their trade agreements as well as more recently their national consultation and engagement mechanisms, which I'm sure we'll discuss together as well. And so because we felt that consultation and engagement were such a critical aspect of bringing these trade policy priorities on the part of Indigenous to actually put them on the table and consider and take them into account, we dedicated an entire section in the study on good practices for engagement with Indigenous peoples on trade, section 11. So I'd like to discuss now, what do these good practices feature? And they feature basically three main things, which are common sense, but it's important to put common sense on the table and to follow it. First is a well-defined structure for the relationship. And what relationship are we talking about? Government to Indigenous. And there are different ways of doing this. The study discusses them in more depth. They involve a two-way learning process, which is pretty critical. Creation of advisory councils could be. And very definitely being inclusive in the participation of the Indigenous representatives. Next slide, please. Second, the creation of channels for engagement during trade negotiations. So one, we have the first step, which is defining a structure to engage. Secondly, defining a channel to do this, to carry out this engagement during actual trade negotiations. They may not be one and the same thing. Yeah, in fact, they usually are not. So there are different examples which the study discusses that have been followed in this regard. There's an IPAC model, which suggests the development of parallel negotiating tracks. There's a model which is New Zealand has followed, which Tane will probably discuss with us in more detail, which provides for advance arrangements for transparency and non-disclosure agreements with the Indigenous representatives and communities for certain issues. And then the example of Canada, where the government has created specific advisory mechanisms that are designed for the negotiation of each particular FTA, which maybe Georgina will discuss with us. So this can be done in different ways, but it's important to have this means of engagement during the negotiations. And third, don't forget about Indigenous after trade agreements are concluded. Be sure that this is they are engaged in the implementation process as well. So these three aspects are very important for engagement and consultation. And lastly, what do we recommend going forward to ensure that progress can continue to be made in the future? And here I'd like to just say that Mia and I, and also Dawn, were all at the WTO Public Forum last month in Geneva. And we listened to a session on enhance, create, and preserve Indigenous trade leadership, where Tane also spoke very eloquently, along with Indigenous representatives from Australia. So I posed a question to the speakers in the panel on what would be their advice as to the best actionable components of free trade agreements that would create the most opportunities for Indigenous peoples in trade. And I was very pleased to note the answers from the panelists paralleled 3 of our 4 recommendations. So that was really a nice thing. And these recommendations are contained in section 13. So what are they? Let's look at them. Recommendation number 1, improve upon, expand, and sustain the consultation and engagement mechanisms between national governments and representatives of Indigenous peoples in developing trade policy, or in the development of trade policy. Consultation and engagement are the fundamental cornerstones to be able to translate Indigenous concerns and priorities into trade provisions. Recommendation number 2, incorporate Indigenous priorities identified in these consultations into the content of the provisions themselves that are negotiated in free trade agreements. How to do this? Well, the study advocates, we advocate in 2 different ways, and both we consider equally important. One, the first is the inclusion of a separate standalone chapter on Indigenous peoples and trade, so that there is a dedicated chapter for Indigenous peoples and trade. Much as there has been a dedicated chapter on SMEs in the past, on the environment, some now on gender, this is important. But additionally, that's not enough. We also think it's important to incorporate relevant provisions throughout the agreement that fulfill the objectives that Mia mentioned, that we identify that provisions do fulfill in the agreements we analyzed, to affirm Indigenous rights, to protect Indigenous knowledge and lands, to provide carve-outs and exclusions in areas of importance for Indigenous interest, and fourthly, to support Indigenous participation in trade through capacity building activities. And of course, we advocate that as many of these provisions as possible should be binding as an aspiration. And our third recommendation would be to include Indigenous representatives into both the discussion and evaluation of the implementation of all agreed provisions, and to monitor this implementation on a regular basis. Don't just drop it once the trade agreement is concluded and put on a shelf. And then we have a 4th recommendation, which we include in the study, which the panelists in the WTO Public Forum did not mention, but we feel is very important. And that is that government should actively pursue the collection of quantitative and qualitative data on trade by Indigenous businesses and service providers, which are needed to evaluate trade agreements, including the impact, both benefits and costs, of any existing or future FTA on Indigenous peoples. Without this data, these impact analyses cannot take place. So it's important to start the collection of the data, and then it's important to mandate the use of this, such as already done in Canada under the GBA Plus analysis for women to do impact analysis on the impacts of free trade agreements on women and the environmental impact analysis. So there's a precedent and a method already existing in Canada. It can be extended to Indigenous peoples once the statistics are there to help us out. So our 4 recommendations can be summarized as consult, engage, follow through, and be better informed. So we hope that these recommendations and the analysis and information and comparative tables contained in this study will be useful to a wide variety of interested audience and government officials in reaching a greater understanding of this important area of inclusive trade policy. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Sherry, just love studies like this where it's practical, policy relevant, and actionable. So thanks very much to both of you. Before we go to the panel, I'd like to know if there's any specific questions on the study or the ideas that we've now placed on the table from the room or from the virtual world out there. This is the audience participation component. Jean-Pierre.
I have a question if no one else is ready
Thank
to
you.
go yet. I was curious, and you answered it, I think, a little bit when you were going over the recommendations, but I was curious on the recommendation for having an Indigenous specific chapter, because you talked about the relevant to have references in the dedicated chapters that scattered throughout, and that is obvious when you're looking to have perhaps binding or non-binding elements related to those 5 areas where we typically see references to involvement with Indigenous peoples. What is the addition? Because I would think that those are the things then that become the most concrete when it comes to actioning the trade agreement. So what additional benefit is there to having a standalone chapter when likely you want to see that the lands, the rights, that all of the 4 elements that Mia had highlighted for us?
That's a very good question. Do you want me to take it?
Sure, please.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jennifer. That's a very good question. The benefit of that chapter, actually, these standalone chapters that we have to consult so far are not very long. So they don't reproduce the type of provisions that you see in the intellectual property chapter or the trade and sustainable development chapter to protect biopiracy, to ensure carve-outs and exceptions. So what does they do? They reaffirm rights of Indigenous, and they are very specific on the type of capacity building activities that can be mutually agreed and carried out. And the best example of this is the Ukraine-Canada free trade agreement, very recent and with a very in-depth specific chapter on Indigenous peoples and trade, where the capacity building activities are extremely detailed. We have a box on this, and that is the advantage of that, because otherwise the capacity building, for example, in any of the other subject chapters, let's take environment, maybe it just says carry out capacity building activities of use to the chapter or something, or as defined by the parties or agreement, with nothing specific. Whereas these in the standalone chapters can be made very, very concrete and therefore be made very useful, because it provides a list of actually targetable and actionable steps that can be taken, that can be mutually discussed and agreed upon. So from my point of view, I see the value primarily there, and in drawing attention to the fact that Indigenous people deserve also a specific mention to draw attention to their needs in trade. Sure.
Mia, did you want to add anything? Please.
I'm having a trouble unmuting myself. Yes, I think just to mention that also when we have a standalone chapter, it is much more easier to link the institutional arrangement, the implementation, the reporting on what needs to be happening and how to monitor it, to attach it to the participation of Indigenous peoples as well. So it can be much more prescriptive in that way. And that in itself, I see as a huge benefit from having such a chapter.
Thanks, Mia. Don, you had a question.
Well, it's, I guess on the same subject about the value of the standalone chapter, I agree that they're important because they give visibility to the issue, and that you can address the issue of rights, although that can be elsewhere in the agreement. Your comment about capacity building commitments, which we have begun finally to make in our cooperation chapters and our FTAs in Canada. The most recent is the Canada-Indonesia CIFA FTA, where the commitment of money for the cooperation is hardwired into the agreement. I just want to say that the other chapters are where the money is. And in particular, the good old goods tariffs chapter and the services chapter as well to some extent, although it's less money. The real money in trade agreements is still the reduction of tariffs on goods. And though you addressed those chapters where there was an explicit reference to Indigenous people, I would want the negotiators to remember that there are Indigenous interests in the tariffs. I mean, they have offensive and defensive interests to promote when you're at the negotiating table. So make sure that you consult them on those issues and build them into your negotiating strategy.
Good point. Yes.
Hi, everyone. I'm Georgina. I'm going to be speaking in a moment as a former trade negotiator for Canada on these issues. I think all of the comments in response to the question have been excellent. And I just wanted to add to that as a supporter and former negotiator of these particular standalone chapters. But I'd like to also note that over time, that chapter has evolved quite a bit from 2017 when we initially developed it for the CUSMA negotiations. And it continues to evolve. But that chapter, this point about the cooperation activities that are listed there, there's quite an extensive list there that we try to get with our trade partners because it inspires action and it lets Indigenous peoples know that we get what the challenges are. Many of those activities address challenges that we've identified through, data, evidence, consultations. And a lot of that has also come out through the gender-based analysis plus as well as we try to sort of identify the barriers and the gaps in activities that could be addressed. You talked about rights. We have begun to start putting in that chapter a non-derogation clause, which prohibits the reduction or removal of laws that protect the rights of Indigenous peoples in order to attract trade and investment. So that's a very important provision in that chapter, and it doesn't occur anywhere else in other chapters, although there's one a little bit like it in the investment chapter. We also have a definition of Indigenous peoples in that chapter now, which is very important. Obviously linked to Canada's constitution in our case, but is relevant to other countries, as you may have seen in the main chapter, which is very interesting, their definition of Indigenous peoples. And the other thing that appears in the standalone chapter, which is really important and gets back to what Sherry was saying, is the commitment to establish a governance mechanism and committee structure and contact points. So action takes place because we need intentional, proactive action on a chapter like this for it to make a difference. We just don't sit and wait until there's a crisis, like we might do on a goods chapter, for example. A committee will meet to solve a problem, not in this type of chapter. You've got to start right away once it's entered into force, develop an action plan and start implementing it with Indigenous peoples, ideally on that committee as well. Sorry, I talked way too long.
Thank you. I just have one last question to both of you, and then we're going to go to the panel. Both of you in different ways talk about how to have new thinking to deal with some of these issues. Both of you have looked at, trade provisions and trade agreements for a long time and try to interpret them. What did you see that you expected, and what was different or unexpected, surprising as you went through the provisions and went through how these things were negotiated, that shows some new thinking or some new approaches to not these issues, but also not just these issues, but inclusive trade issues more generally?
You want to start, Sherry, or shall I start?
Over to you, Maya, please.
Okay. Well, unexpected, maybe really the legal diversity between the agreements and really just the level in which these provisions are actually mentioned in many of the agreements not being there at all, particularly in the developing economies. And I think I was most surprised by that in a negative way. In a positive way, I actually quite like the institutional creativity of IPAC. And I think the co-governance is really a good approach to try to expand and deepen in some other inclusivity areas as well. So yeah, so in negative way, really the slow progress and diversity and the persistent gap, while in a positive way, this institutional creativity of IPAC.
Okay, thanks, Mia. That's great. That gave me a chance to reflect a little bit. I think what was unexpected for me was there was no definition of Indigenous peoples. And that's really interesting. And there's no common definition used anywhere. As Georgina mentioned, each sort of, most agreements don't define it all, or those that have started to mention Indigenous interests, they don't define. I think that this subject of trying to define who your counterpart is really only came into being when the standalone chapters started to be developed. So I think one is learning a lot. I'm not sure a definition is absolutely critical because the definition is context dependent and country dependent and agreement dependent. But that's interesting. What else was interesting was what Mia alluded to were these different patterns that emerged when we didn't know there would be patterns when we started looking at all these agreements. I mean, first we had to, trudge through, I don't know how many hundreds of agreements. And then we finally got to, 36 that actually mentioned Indigenous peoples over the last 20 years. That's not that many, really, in the end. So I guess I just assumed that there would be a lot of mentions in these agreements. But in fact, in most of them, and at least half of them, there were not that many. Even in some of the more important plurilateral agreements that we looked at, like RCEP, I mean, barely a mention. So there's something to be looked at behind the scenes there. I mean, why not? Why not? Because inclusive trade is not yet important and to economies in this region. There must be other, I mean, it's not yet on the table, and yet there are some examples which are starting to emerge. The more recent agreements of Chinese Taipei, for example, go much further. But on the whole, as Mia said, there was this big diversity, even among this select group of 36 agreements that emerged. And that's why we grouped them in the way we grouped them, because there were patterns. And the EU and the EFTA agreements were really focused on intellectual property, as if the Indigenous didn't exist in other spheres of trade policy. And CASPA was the first agreement which incorporated mentions of Indigenous peoples in a wider diversity of chapters. And that was pretty far-looking for its time. So that was really well done. And the more recent agreements that Canada and New Zealand have negotiated have been very proactive in incorporating several mentions across the board. But this is still exceptional. So, we say on the whole, there are a lot of mentions relatively, but you have to look at where these mentions have been actually, who has done them, and over what time period. It's been a handful of countries over the last 5 or 6 years. So I think we didn't know that when we started doing this research. Nobody knew that, I think. So I think that's a really interesting aspect that I wouldn't have been able to speak to at all in the beginning. And then just to say what Mia discussed about the co-governance of IPETCA, yes, but I don't think any of the trade agreements have really gone into co-governance. And the question really there is to go further and to ask, would it be possible for legally binding trade agreements to go into a co-governance mode? And I think that's not obvious at the outset. So yes, IPAC is a very good model, but can it be married or combined with a modern legal trade agreement framework? I'm not sure we have that answer yet.
Great. Thanks very much.
You.
Thanks, Mia. Thanks, Sherry. We'll come back to you if we have any questions after the panel, but I'd like to now put a greater focus on Canada and implications for Canadian trade policy and certainly trade negotiations. We have three great panelists. Our first is Georgina Wainwright-Kinderam, and until recently was negotiating inclusive trade provisions in Canada's trade agreements and as lead negotiator. And so now that she has stepped back and is independent, it would be very interesting to find 10 feet above, 20 feet above. What happened? What does this all mean? And if you were, you saw this study, how would you use it in your preparation and thinking through our negotiation strategy for Canada? So,
Well,
Georgina, please.
great. Thank you, Phil, and thank you for the discussion so far. I thought this study that we've just heard about from Sherry and Mia was really comprehensive, really insightful, and I gained a lot from it, for sure. It's great to see, even though the numbers, as you said, there's really very few trade agreements out there, very few countries taking this on. It's still great to see how many countries are taking it on, actually, including developing countries embracing Indigenous related provisions. You know, when I was, I read every single word in this study, and I was really struck by the provisions that the EU and EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, have done in the intellectual property chapter around traditional knowledge. I particularly liked the FPIC references, free, prior, informed consent. I feel like we could learn from some of the language there in our trade agreements. The European Free Trade Area did achieve language around this with developing countries, Colombia, Costa Rica, Philippines, and Indonesia. This is on the FPIC angle in the intellectual property chapter. So I was very encouraged by that. But before I get into sort of like, you know, generally more about the study, I want to sort of begin by sort of stating maybe an obvious fact to trade negotiators, but may not be so obvious to anyone else. And it's come up a lot already in the discussion. So why don't we have more Indigenous provisions in trade agreements or more standalone chapters that have been successfully negotiated? Well, I mean, the point is we need a willing trade partner, right? I mean, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, we may be very ambitious in the outset. This is our strategy. We're going to pursue this. But we need a willing trade partner on the other side. And we have to compromise if we are going to get something in. And we do have to reduce our ambition often. We do have to compromise. We have to make the case in the first case why we should even be talking about these issues. We've got to make the economic case for these countries about why Indigenous provisions is important to them. Never mind Canada. We're the proponent, but we've got to make the case for them and make it real. Show the economic development benefits, the social dividends, the peace, harmony, unity outcomes that can happen in an economy when you support Indigenous peoples or marginalized peoples. Because in some of these countries, I mean, even if they have endorsed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, they might come out and say, well, everyone in our country is Indigenous, or no one in our country is Indigenous. So you've really got to sort of deal with where these countries are at. And it can be very, very tough. You may spend a year and a half just trying to convince them. And then when you finally do, you close the chapter in a couple of rounds. But it is tough. So that's why you don't see as much as you might think you would see. So that's sort of just like a basic starting point. I think the other thing that I want to say before I get into it is that, you know, this isn't easy doing trade negotiations on Indigenous issues, but it's not easy on any issue, frankly, and especially now as we have a changing global trade system, as everyone knows, there's threats out there, and there's pressure for all countries to ensure that our foreign policy, trade policy, and development policy is quite complementary and coherent amongst those sets of policies, but also backstopped by relevant, coherent, complementary policies that from a domestic point of view, right? They all have to play together and make sense. And this can be very, very challenging. So with that, I'm going to start with some of the key elements that came out of the study and sort of how I would use them if I was still doing trade negotiations. First of all, I find this inventory fantastic. The database is so clear. It's a really super high value contribution. I think it shows Canada's and New Zealand's leadership in this space. I would encourage all lead negotiators to really review that inventory in great detail. You know, we're always looking for precedents so we can hold it over a trade partner. What you've agreed here, maybe you can agree that with us, but let's push it forward even more. I find it a practical tool. It inspires innovation, and it's great to see the evolution of language over time, you know, from trade partners as they agree to things and become more comfortable. Indigenous issues for a lot of countries is very new, but it's also quite threatening actually as well. So again, you've got to meet them where they're at and convince them of the importance of moving forward on protecting and promoting Indigenous rights, interests, needs, and responsibilities. There's a whole package of themes here that we need to be promoting and protecting. And it's not just about Indigenous peoples in Canada for Canada. When we endorsed UNDRIP in 2016, our responsibility as a country expanded to the Indigenous peoples around the world. This is what I have understood from, you know, the leads on Indigenous issues in Canada. We have to advance and protect and promote the Indigenous interests in all countries, including developing countries. So this is another reason why we should be advancing these interests around the world. I think this large inventory that you've developed shows the growing importance of these issues. It is still marginal, as you said, but things have come a long way in 20 years, but it's not mainstream yet. But there's ideas in the study that can help us expand it and really start to leverage the development benefits of these provisions. On the categories that you identified for the four categories that the authors identified for the types of provisions in all these trade agreements. Again, I think it's great to sort of see them organized in this way. But you know, as a former trade negotiator, I never sort of thought of them quite the way you identified them, but I like that academic angle on them. But as a former trade negotiator, I always try to look for provisions that would take effect behind the border in Canada, at the border, or beyond the border in the jurisdiction of the trade partner. So, and you know, I really did feel like, and even in the categories in your paper, a lot of those provisions would take effect behind the border in Canada. Our policies, our programs, our laws to support Indigenous peoples, and hopefully through cooperation activities, through sharing lessons learned, best practices, we can promote those experiences to our trade partner so they have an effect in the trade partner's jurisdiction as well. But I really did feel that because Canada had a lot already in place, although we could always do more, admittedly, you know, I felt like the priority for me was looking to have trade provisions that would take effect in the other country or at the border. So at the border provisions, I don't really see that we've got too many of those. I like, you know, Dawn's point earlier around you know, tariffs and goods related provisions. I think temporary entry provisions are potentially a really interesting opportunity. I could speak more about that later. Trade facilitation provisions, technical barriers to trade provisions would all be provisions that would take place at the border and could help both countries facilitate trade. In the CUSMA agreement, one area where we do have a very innovative trade provision for Indigenous peoples, and it also occurs in the CPTPP as well, is in rules of origin. And it allows for Indigenous made goods, handicraft goods, to have preferential access if they meet certain conditions. But the point is, we haven't operationalized that article in CUSMA yet. And I have some ideas on how we might actually do that. So we can talk more about that later, maybe. Anyways, beyond the border, so in the jurisdiction of the other trade partner, I think the cooperation, capacity building, the activities that could be developed and implemented together, this is where the development benefits come out, for both sides, because we want to have Indigenous peoples from Canada also participating, engaging, and having opportunities created for them. But non-discrimination provisions, non-discrimination based on indigeneity, non-derogation provisions, so laws aren't laws that protect Indigenous peoples aren't reduced in order to attract trade or investment. These are really important areas that take effect beyond a border. So these are sort of a different way that I would look at them, although I really appreciated the categories developed by the authors. On the recommendations, I find them all really realistic, practical, and doable. And let's just do it, right? I think Canada should take on these recommendations, announce that we're doing it, set a timeline, deliver, and be accountable for them. I really think Canada is off to a head start on meeting these recommendations, given our progress and experience to date. If I had to choose the top one to sort of say, do it right away, it would be number one, improve the consultation and engagement mechanisms between the governments and Indigenous peoples. And certainly since 2017, when Canada started doing this in a much more proactive and structured way, we've gotten better at it, we've innovated, and we continue to innovate. We've got some very good structures and systems in place right now. But from my point of view, we've got to take it one step further and actually get Indigenous peoples at the negotiating table, especially if we're getting a standalone chapter and have them there. This is really new idea. This is really breaking new ground, but it really moves us beyond our comfort zone in trade negotiations. And it allows us to, it's going to help us identify Indigenous interests and rights early and not assume that we know what their rights and interests are in connection to, a chapter that they have so far not had any engagement on. So we just can't, assume that we'll consult with them when we think it's relevant to consult with them. We need them at the table consistently so they tell us what's relevant to them. We have to get beyond our assumptions here and move beyond our comfort zone. The data point is really key. I really support that. I think what I would add to that is that we need to start embedding a commitment to collecting and analyzing Indigenous related data in our trade agreements. We do that on the gender chapter. We could do it in the Indigenous chapter, for example. And part of that would be identifying indicators for measuring results and impact, because not necessarily the data that you collect would be relevant in that regard. This would help do GBA plus, as you mentioned, and expanding it to the Indigenous side. I'm about to wrap up because we want to have more of a discussion here. I'm running out of time, but I did want to sort of mention that I'd be happy to talk more about the implications for negotiations, bilateral, but also multilateral and plurilateral of this work, including CUSMA negotiations, which are going to come up soon for Canada. There's lots of ideas here that could inspire experiments in this space, especially learning from the progress that has been made on trade and gender over the past several years at the WTO and in other fora. We can sort of replicate and be inspired by that on the Indigenous side. I think we really need to work more closely between trade and development in this department to really realize and develop the development benefits of these trade agreements. And I have some ideas of that. But just to sort of conclude, I think we need to continue to pursue this multi-pronged approach that you also talked about, Sherry. We need to continue seeking trade Indigenous peoples standalone chapters, provisions in other chapters, including our Indigenous general exception, which is so important for Indigenous peoples. We have to start with our high ambition, which has been our strategy over the years, but calibrate and be strategic and be smart as we may need to be given the trade partner that we've got. But we have to build on what we've achieved, take the lessons we've learned, but we can't regress. This is really Canada's brand, I would say. And we have to move beyond the assumption that we've done everything we can in our trade agreements, that there's really no more space to do more on Indigenous issues, because I really think there is a lot. Looking at other chapters and really looking for opportunities and barriers. Okay, I'll leave it.
Thanks, Georgina. I don't know about everybody else, but I'm really getting my trade policy geek on now. So thank you. This is a great segue to Cody Lewis, a proud Mi'kmaq professional based in Ontario with strong expertise in Indigenous trade policy and export development project management. He's working currently at Makwate, Canada's leading Indigenous consulting firm. And he takes a two-eyed approach to looking at the issues and providing practical advice to clients. And he was directly involved when he was at the Canadian Council of Indigenous Business on consultations on these issues. So Cody, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Hello, bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invite. Greatly appreciate it. As Phil already mentioned, my name is Cody Lewis. I'm a member of the Halibut First Nation in Newfoundland, where I just so happen to be joining you from today, but normally I'm based in Ontario. I'm a project manager at Makwate, and part of that role, I had the pleasure of working with CCIB for a number of years on these files. I guess personally, when I became involved in this work, there was a lot of enthusiasm around what is called inclusive trade. It was framed as a progressive shift, trade that works for more people, that reflects diversity and equity. And there's no question that inclusivity is important. However, there's a bit of a need to understand that inclusive trade and Indigenous trade are not the same thing. Inclusivity expands participation, whereas Indigenous trade asserts recognition. It's the difference between being invited to take part in someone else's agenda and having the ability to define your own. And that distinction matters. When Indigenous rights and interests get folded under a broad inclusivity umbrella, the conversation tends to flatten. Indigenous peoples get listed alongside women, youth, newcomers, small business owners, which are all vital groups, but not inherent rights holders in the same way that Indigenous peoples are. And once that distinction is blurred, so is accountability. You see this in most trade frameworks where Indigenous perspectives are referenced, but the real authority and the ability to meaningfully shape positions, set priorities, or hold space in negotiations largely remains with government. We need to be honest about the limitations that approach is created. By framing Indigenous participation as an inclusivity measure, progress has slowed in some ways, although there has been significant progress to date. Instead of moving toward genuine partnership grounded in rights as affirmed by treaties, Section 35, UNDRIP, the ILO Convention 169, this work has often circled around consultation without enabling Indigenous-led decision-making, somewhat limiting the art of the possible to what can be pursued through the lens of inclusivity instead of actual rights recognition. For example, there have been situations where Indigenous trade chapters were at risk of not being included because other countries had issue with the inclusion of the other inclusive trade chapters. If Indigenous trade is important, then it should be its own item and led by the people that actually understand the issues, instead of those that are passionate about inclusivity in general, although while well-intentioned, many of those efforts have fallen short in various ways. As such, distinguishing inclusive trade from Indigenous trade is now more important than ever, given the shifts in paradigms relating to inclusivity that have been happening across the world. And while it's important to be inclusive, this should, in my opinion, not come at the progress in advancing Indigenous trade. When we talk about Indigenous trade priorities, whether it's protecting traditional knowledge, ensuring cultural property rights, or securing procurement opportunities for Indigenous businesses, these aren't just economic interests, they're tied to governance, to stewardship, the exercise of inherent rights, and they require trade policies that see Indigenous nations as governments in their own rights, where that's possible, not just as economic participants. The second theme I want to touch on is capacity. We talk about partnership, co-development, and engagement, but these things can't exist without balanced capacity. And right now, there is a bit of an asymmetrical balance going on there. In the years I've worked in this space, I've seen the government of Canada expand its internal teams for Indigenous trade. There are now full-time units, new policy staff, and dedicated resources within Global Affairs Canada that continue to grow to this day. And that's progress on one level as it signals institutional attention. But on the Indigenous side, capacity has not grown as much as it should have. In fact, in many cases, I found that it's diminished in various ways. While membership of Canada's Indigenous Working Group on Trade has grown significantly, with that can come a lack of focus and organizations being at different levels of capacity, so it can be hard to move some of these conversations forward. As such, the same handful of Indigenous trade experts are being stretched into multiple processes, and others who were deeply involved kind of left the group, and with that, a lot of the capacity evaporated. If we're serious about advancing Indigenous participation in trade, that has to change. We need investments in Indigenous-led institutions, Indigenous trade research hubs, legal and policy institutes, training programs that build technical expertise within Indigenous organizations, not just alongside the government. There have been various calls for such institutions. CCIB, who I used to work for, is one of them, but there have been many others within Canada and internationally. As is mentioned in the report, Te Mata and Aotearoa, or New Zealand, is a current example of one such institution and a model that merits further assessment, but even their capacity can be limited. Capacity funding should be directed to Indigenous nations and organizations that can represent their own interests globally, not only to the departments managing the file, and that's what will make this work sustainable. A good example of where that investment could make a difference is in developing mechanisms for Indigenous to Indigenous international trade collaboration, connecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis businesses with Indigenous partners abroad, creating trade networks that operate on shared values and principles of reciprocity. And that's the kind of innovation that can only come from Indigenous leadership and the establishment of true relationships. Instead, what has happened is non-Indigenous organizations continue to receive capacity funding to facilitate inclusive trade, with Indigenous trade being a part of it, but don't necessarily have the background, understanding, or authority to be doing this for Indigenous peoples, going back to that principle of nothing about us without us. A recent example of that would be the trade mission led to Osaka, Japan, which was essentially facilitated by a non-Indigenous organization, which, in my opinion, was a slightly missed opportunity to build capacity among Indigenous organizations to lead these efforts. The final theme I'd like to touch upon, which Georgina covered earlier, is specificity and carve-outs. Many of you will be familiar with the language used in Canada's free trade agreements, the carve-outs and exceptions that refer to Indigenous peoples' rights or obligations. On paper, they're very promising, but in practice, too many are drafted so broadly or so ambiguously that they become a challenge to operationalize. For example, provisions meant to protect Indigenous procurement opportunities are often so vaguely worded that procurement officers don't know how to apply them. Clauses meant to safeguard traditional knowledge or cultural expressions are often referenced, but without clear mechanisms for enforcement or benefit sharing. A specific example of this, which Georgina mentioned earlier, can be found in Kuzma with the article that covers Indigenous handicraft goods. The article allows the parties to mutually identify particular goods that qualify as Indigenous handicrafts, but standards for this have not been developed to date, and the provision has not been operationalized. And when those clauses go unused, the precedent they set is that they're unnecessary, which can weaken their inclusion in future agreements. We need to do better. That means developing clear operational language and trade agreements around Indigenous procurement, intellectual property, traditional knowledge and cultural expressions, market access, and other areas deemed relevant to Indigenous peoples. We need language that Indigenous governments and businesses can actually apply in real world contexts. And that requires Indigenous experts at the table from the very beginning, not just reacting to drafts, but co-drafting them to the highest extent possible. The approach that currently exists has been developed through iteration over time and changes from one free trade agreement to another, but this doesn't necessarily move things forward in the way that they could and should be. Going back to the art of the possible, what's really needed, in my opinion, is the co-development of an ideal Indigenous trade chapter that substantively addresses Indigenous priorities and can be used as a template for future agreements, which we have slightly arrived at, but there is room to improve in that front and to actually focus on that. Another area of opportunity would be to proactively explore opportunities with strong precedents for Indigenous trade chapters can be set with willing partners. While there can be sometimes a need to compromise, we should be putting our best foot forward in most of these negotiations. If there's one overarching message I'd leave you with today, it's this: we've made progress in visibility. Indigenous peoples are now consistently mentioned in Canada's trade agenda. That's a good step, but visibility is an influence. Influence comes from three things: recognizing the difference between inclusion and rights, particularly the importance of distinguishing Indigenous trade from inclusive trade, investing in Indigenous-led capacity and institutions, and thirdly, ensuring specificity and usability in how Indigenous priorities are reflected in trade agreements. That's how we move from being consulted to being true partners, from being referenced in footnotes to meaningfully shaping the chapters themselves and being able to advance our own agendas. With that being said, I do commend all of the Indigenous representatives involved and global affairs on the progress that has been made to date, but still have a long way to go, which is why this report is so helpful, as it really provides an overview of some of those areas of opportunity and has really laid out a clear path forward, I would say. But with that being said, Walalan, thank you, merci. I look forward to your questions and perspectives on how we can continue moving this forward. And yeah, that'll be the end of my presentation.
Excellent, Cody. Thanks very much. We're now going to go to New Zealand. Tanya Wakeford. It's now 7:30 in the morning, but it's also tomorrow. So maybe he actually had more sleep than we think he's had by getting up this morning in New Zealand to join us today. Tanya is lead advisor Maori Trade in the Trade Policy Engagement and Implementation Division in the New Zealand Ministry of Trade and Foreign Affairs and Trade. Tanya, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, everyone. Tuatahi me mihi atu kia koutou, ko tau mai tēnei wā, tēnei rā. Koutou ko tau mai, me mihi anō ki ngā tangata whenua ngā iwi takitaki ko tau mai, tēnā koutou, kia ora mai koutou katoa. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I want to acknowledge everyone who's attending this call today, but wanted to pay particular tribute to the Indigenous voices and the Indigenous representatives who are on this call and who are gathered. I feel very privileged to be part of this discussion and humbled to be invited. Thank you very much. I regret that I'm not there with you in person. If this took place 2 weeks ago, then I could, as I was in Ottawa, and I really enjoyed my meetings. I found them to be really productive and fruitful. Also, I feel very privileged to have worked directly in this area on Indigenous trade policy over the last 4 years, and to bring to bear some of my learnings and experiences. I want to firstly acknowledge the very important and close relationship that New Zealand has with Canada. We've done a lot together, and there's still a lot more that we can continue to work together on to help shift the dial, as it were. Also want to acknowledge the EDM mechanism. I think it's really cool. and pay tribute to the investment and to the resourcing and to the effort that's gone into promoting more accessible and more inclusive trade. Yes, we've seen progress on Indigenous trade policy and outcomes, and I'm proud to have been part of that development, but more importantly, the learnings. And what I've learned and continue to hear is that we're well short of the mark. And so I'll probably speak to a bit more of that, and probably a bit more in line with what we've just heard from Cody. So instead of reading out some of the outcomes and products that we New Zealand have attained in the last few years, a bit like a report card, I'll probably speak more to the gaps that I'm seeing and hearing and continue to hear, and I hear it often. What I have to share is intentionally provocative and shouldn't be taken as a criticism as such. In fact, we should acknowledge the progress that's been made, and we need to keep evolving. So on Indigenous trade, to be honest, I don't know exactly when all of this started, but I'm pleased to see that Indigenous trade policy discussions are now firmly in our consciousness, as evidenced by this gathering and by the report that's been done. It regularly features in multilateral, regional, bilateral fora and mechanisms such as IPAC, WTO, OECD, CPTPP, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the Inclusive Trade Action Group, and in trade negotiations and agreements. And from time to time, might even get a mention in a ministerial or leader statement. Yay. That said, advancing Indigenous interests in a meaningful way in these fora remains incredibly challenging, not to mention spiritually and emotionally taxing. These things are still on the periphery. When having and introducing these topics and discussions, it requires evidence, data, justifications, rationalization, explanations, reports, disaggregated data, compromise, new and creative ways of explaining old, ancient thinking. And this is just to get parties to the discussion table, let alone the negotiation table between government officials who have the awesome power to decide who's in, who's out, what's in, what's out, with no independent Indigenous voices, notwithstanding any officials in those discussions who may happen to be Indigenous, and so often with the prospect of a low-level, non-binding reference or product. I was previously posted to Brazil and had the opportunity to visit the Amazon. And I often like to compare this situation, this work, Indigenous trade, operating within or alongside or adjacent to what we know to be the rules-based order. I like to compare it to the meeting of the two waters on the Amazon River. Rio Negro, the Black River, Rio Blanco, the White River. Each with different origins, composition, temperatures, speeds that literally flow alongside each other and do not mix. And so the question that I have is, what place do Indigenous perspectives have within the established trade rules, quote unquote? Do they have a place? Do they mix? If the trading system is orthodoxy, then Indigenous approaches that prioritize ancestry, connectivity, relationships, stars, wind, oceans, planetary movements, mountains, rivers, plants, earth, sky, people, posterity, co-order or wellness, past, present, future, prayer, collectivity, reciprocity, balance, sharing, sacredness. What place do these elements or aspects have If orthodoxy is your trade rules, then these are surely your unorthodox. So for example, drawing on the river metaphor, can the trade liberalization river mix with what we might determine or frame as the guardianship or kaitiakitanga river? Or must they run alongside each other or in opposite directions with different origins and different destinations? So as an Indigenous person who also happens to be a trade practitioner on Indigenous trade engagement, trade policy development, trade negotiations, and who operates within those multilateral and regional bilateral fora and mechanisms, I can most certainly attest to the challenges that come with navigating these different rivers, currents, and flows. And so often what I see, hear, and feel is the disconnect between what Indigenous peoples want and what Indigenous peoples get. Yes, trade matters, jobs matter, increased earnings matter, closing the gap matters, addressing the impacts of colonization matters. And yes, increased or better market access and the frameworks that FTAs create, including rules and cooperation, all of those things matter. But if trade and jobs and money come at the expense of land, resource, cultural language, or identity loss, then what is it all for? Ultimately, trade must balance and support social, cultural, and environmental outcomes. And this is what I would describe as drawing on the river metaphor again, the Tino Rangatiratanga River, or the self-determination river, where Indigenous peoples get to determine, shape, and achieve their aspirations. Any analysis must place this at its foundation. It necessarily goes further than engagement, consultation, advisory groups. With the greatest respect, the notion of nothing about us without us falls short. It still suggests a power imbalance, much like a fiduciary or a trustee relationship. Instead, we need to shift our thinking and our systems from a power imbalance to a power rebalance that recognizes the role of Indigenous leadership, or mana, within their respective societies and their attendant legal rights, and that sees and treats them as equals. This often requires mediation, remediation, restoration, reconciliation, and remuneration. Are these things achievable? Well, they're most certainly challenging, but also aspirational. If we are to change the outcomes, we need to change the language that we use, to change our thinking in order to change our practices and our systems. If I may, if there is to be a meaningful shift, then Indigenous voices, perspectives, leadership, and representation must be brought to the center. That includes actively recruiting, promoting, and elevating Indigenous voices and leadership within government institutions. It also means that something or someone or some people has to give in order to make place for those Indigenous voices and perspectives at the table. Just in closing, and mindful of the time, I do want to acknowledge that there are some Indigenous voices and some Indigenous experts on this call. I'd love to hear from them in particular, their perspectives on how indigeneity can be better incorporated in a more meaningful way, including, I'm pleased to see some experts from New Zealand on this call. Me mihi anō kia koutou, ko taimai tēnā koutou. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tene. The floor is open. We have a few questions already in the chat. If others have questions, please put them in the chat or bring them up in this room. Panelists, if you're interested in responding to the questions, I'm going to read a few now. If you're interested in responding and you're online, just put up your hand so I can see that you want to provide some input. And we have about 20 minutes, so let's get at it. Matthew asks, do developing countries that do not wish to include provisions on Indigenous peoples do so for cultural or political reasons rather than economic ones? Ramesh asks, if developed countries introduced rules on labor, environment, and other issues in FTAs, which developing countries usually resisted, are issues of relevance to Indigenous peoples different? Those are two big questions, just to start off. So nobody's afraid. Anybody else want to put on some questions before we go to the panelists? Who wants to answer those questions? I'm just the moderator. Georgina wants to start? Please.
On the first question, which I understood to be, why would some developing countries not want to accept Indigenous provisions? Is it from a cultural, political, or economic point of view? You know, I would say it's from all of them. They may not see the economic value to them if their Indigenous peoples are particularly marginalized. You know, there could be political points of view here that if they had provisions like that in the trade agreement, they wouldn't get stakeholder support. You know, whether the stakeholders are outside government or within government, other government ministries may not support those efforts. There's a sense in some countries, I think, that if Indigenous people shouldn't get special treatment compared to, say, other marginalized groups. So, it's really working through those concerns and issues to sort of show how, well, as my goodness, Tane has so eloquently expressed, how and why Indigenous peoples are so distinct and unique and have these collective rights that have to be understood and respected and just reconsidered in the context of a trade agreement. So I would say they're all relevant to why a country would say no. But I think, we don't give up too easily in Canada on this, and we keep trying to sort of, as I said before, bring them along, show the economic benefits, show the social benefits, the sustainable development benefits, and make the linkages to international multilateral conventions or agreements that they have signed on to, and show them how we can make this real for them in a very practical way, like the true benefits of agreeing to something like this, what they're going to get out of it.
Thank you. Don.
Yes, sorry. I can't help but add that developing countries often resist the discussion of issues with which they're unfamiliar.
Yes.
And so just a little bit of information can often bridge the gap between the negotiating positions. And I think that's why this paper is so useful to negotiators. And I on both sides of the table. When you're unfamiliar with the issue, you're reluctant to take obligations. It's as simple as that. So anyway, I think this is a real contribution to moving that agenda forward.
Could I just add one more thing to
That, and then I'll go to Tene.
and what I picked up on what you said there too, Don, is the point around obligations. So in our Indigenous chapter, typically they have not been enforceable or binding. So this gives a safe space to learn and cooperate and build buy-in. And when you have provisions that are cooperation and capacity building oriented, it's not threatening. So we try and sort of bring them along, like maybe hopefully in the future time, we might make a binding chapter, but this is a good early first step on these cooperation provisions.
Thank you. Tane, please.
Thanks, everyone. Look, I wanted to give some practical examples of some of the learnings that we've taken over recent years. So I won't say who it was that we were negotiating with, but in these dedicated Indigenous chapters, Māori trade chapters, with one party, what we did was draft it, share it with the trade representative groups that we engage with, our treaty partners, essentially hoping that they would rubber stamp it, which they did not. In fact, it opened up a very challenging conversation, which was who wrote it and how dare you write this for us? And so what they did was they took the text that we'd done, went away, rewrote it, sent it back to us and said, here, present this. For the next negotiation, not wanting to repeat those mistakes, I flipped it around and said, right, we're negotiating with partner X. You tell us what should go in this. You write it. And we'll remunerate you for your time and your expertise and your mana. That last bit I actually didn't have the budget for it, but had to scramble around to find some. But it's just an example of how we took the learnings, how we heard, and flipped it around. And so we actually ended up presenting that text to the negotiating partner, and it was very high level, very far reaching, and very high standard that the negotiating partner found very difficult and challenging. But at least it opened up that conversation, and in the end, we got an outcome that was less than what our Indigenous partners wanted, but was better than what we could have gotten on our own.
That was great. Thank you. Cody, if I may, I'm going to ask you for some experiences you've had in the consultations. But before I go there, are there other questions on the table? Inside or outside this room? Cody, what has been your experience in these consultations, and what insights have you derived from that that you now apply in your practice? And if you were involved in consultations in the future, how would you approach them differently?
In terms of developing countries?
Just your own positions, not necessarily developing countries.
In terms of high-level lessons learned, I would say most partners can be fairly willing to pursue Indigenous trade chapters, depending on the provisions within. A lot of times when you speak about it in terms of mutual benefit, that's when you can find a lot of success. I would say one of my key lessons learned is that there's very much a need to ensure conversations amongst Indigenous representatives from both countries while ongoing, while the negotiations are ongoing. I found with various chapters in the past where there has been Indigenous peoples on the other side, there has been a bit of lack of communication between us, except for when the agreement itself is largely finalized. And at that point, there isn't much of an opportunity to insert additional language in that regard. Yeah, I'd say main lesson learned for me is just really ensuring that communication on both sides. Not the most substantive answer to the question, perhaps, but.
No, it is, because thank you very much. Other comments, questions? Yes.
Yeah. Did you want to go ahead, Joanna?
If I could just add a quick comment to what Cody has just said there. I think, what we have also found working with some countries, if they have Indigenous peoples in their countries, they may not have any systems in place to engage with them or do consultations. I mean, Canada has established such systems now, and they continue to evolve. But some countries have just no idea of even where to begin to talk to their Indigenous peoples. And some of them, and then there might be a country where they have like 400 different languages they would have to, translate every single document into to get a reaction. So that is a challenge, but that is where I also think, Canada or New Zealand could work with the other trade partner to help them develop those systems early on, even before trade negotiations start, and get those relationships established in support of a government negotiator, but also do what Cody is saying and have Indigenous to Indigenous discussions taking place parallel to a trade negotiation if you don't actually have them at the table. But this is a huge challenge, just the initial understanding of, well, where are our Indigenous peoples? How do we even be in touch with them?
Thank you. Shankar.
I'm happy to let participants online go first.
My friend and former colleague Ramesh Chaitu. Ramesh, please.
You're on.
Ramesh, you're on mute.
Just trying to give him the permission to unmute.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Kristen.
Well, I can
We-
I can launch my question first, maybe, and
Yeah,
then.
if you could wait just a minute, Ramesh,
Yeah.
we'll come right back.
So I was curious from the table that was put up during the first part of the presentation, to see that country like Peru, and I know other countries in some of the multi-country agreements had so little, in fact, when they have legislation domestically or they have other obligations that require them to look to the Indigenous rights and peoples, and however it's structured in their own communities. And I just wondered how much, and you speak to it a little bit, Jen, in your experience with Brazil too, maybe, but how much of a driver is it to already have pre-existing, I mean, you talked about it in terms of country to country experience, but how much of a driver is it to already have an existing legal framework within a country to be able to then more easily engage? But then it's surprising that where that does exist, you don't see it as much in the study in terms of the outcomes. And I'm just curious, how much is that related to cost? I mean, maybe that was the first question too, right? But the economic driver, is there a cost or a fear of I don't know, it just seemed inconsistent with my understanding of how some of those countries engage domestically with their own Indigenous populations. I don't know what your experiences are on that.
Tana, do you feel comfortable answering that question?
Sure. It's important to acknowledge that the difference in the distinction between our various systems. And so while there are some obvious commonalities between New Zealand and Canada, for example, Commonwealth countries, common law based, we are vastly different in terms of size and breadth and population size and land mass, and with our different histories and connections with Indigenous peoples. And so for New Zealand, we have the Treaty of Waitangi that is all rather encompassing for New Zealand. And so it provides some quite clear parameters and frameworks for its implementation. It can be distilled down to some quite simple concepts or principles. How you might compare that with, say, Canada or the US or other countries, it really is for each country to determine for itself with its Indigenous peoples what their sort of constitutional relationship or engagement mechanisms might look like, and how that might be best organized, resourced, and so on.
Thanks, Tana. Ramesh, sorry, do you want to comment?
Thanks very much. Just a comment in this regard. I'm not a negotiator, so I'm not speaking from a government perspective, but I think Jennifer's observation is very interesting. And it is true that it seems a bit paradoxical that so many countries in Latin America have very little in their FTAs on Indigenous people, or nothing at all. Chile has absolutely no mention of Indigenous people in any of its free trade agreements. And it's negotiated more free trade agreements than almost any country in the world, other than perhaps Mexico. And, Mexico before CUSMA had, none at all. Peru, almost nothing. Bolivia, nothing. So why? And this is interesting. I don't have an answer for you, but I do have an observation, which is recently Canada completed a negotiation of an FTA with Ecuador. And Ecuador actively engaged in a chapter on Indigenous peoples. We hope there's a chapter. And Ecuador has the Pachamama as part, Mother Earth, as actually it's the heart of its national constitution. So, and Indigenous people are very, very important in Ecuador. And it will be very interesting to see how this has played out in the actual agreement, because if the agreement is successful in being, well, we know it's been successfully negotiated, but if it will be actually implemented in the future, we will be able to see what it contains. And then Ecuador, this FTA might serve as a path-breaking example for other countries in Latin America to start taking up this area more seriously. And it might inspire their own Indigenous communities to ask for it in trade relations. Just an observation.
Thanks, Sherry. Ramesh, if your mic is now on, you have the last question.
Okay, thank you, Phil. It's a very interesting discussion, and I'm particularly pleased to hear views from New Zealand, etc. Phil, I want to revisit my question, the first part, which you sort of forgot to mention. The Standing Committee on International Trade, this is for the foreigners, the Canadian Standing Committee, which is part of the Parliament, recommended that the Government of Canada ensure that no trade agreement between Canada and Ecuador is concluded without full, transparent, and effective consultation, with no agreement is implemented without pre-FPIC consent of the affected Indigenous peoples in Ecuador. The Canadian government response was quite interesting, but not surprising. It said, more or less, paraphrasing, that Ecuador is a sovereign government and we really can't compel them to do anything. Now, my question is, I sit in Europe, where the Europeans have imposed all kinds of requirements on developing countries, including now a carbon tax at the border, etc., etc. So my question is, if rich countries have introduced all kinds of things of interest to them, to developing countries with which they frame trade agreements, is the Canadian response really the appropriate thing in today's world? If we talk about inclusive trade, and I frame it in the context not of Canada, but other agreements that will be negotiated that have Indigenous provisions, etc. The question of free, prior, and informed consent, will that become then a sort of guiding or fundamental principle like most favored nation treatment or national treatment in your traditional trade agreement? So I don't know if the panelists or any of the presenters have any reaction to that. I don't think we'll have an answer, but I'm curious to hear a suggestion, or perhaps for the former negotiator, if I got the name right, is it Georgina?
Yes.
That's it.
Georgina's. Thanks, Ramesh. Tane's got his hand up, and Georgina also wants to comment. Tane, please.
Sorry, my comment is not in relation to the question that Ramesh has posed.
Sorry, Georgina, please, and then over to.
Yeah, thank you. No, that's a really, really great question. And, here in Canada, there was a lot of media coverage soon after the Ecuador trade agreement was concluded. CONAI, which represents Indigenous peoples in Ecuador, were protesting the conclusion of this trade agreement, claiming that they had not been effectively consulted by the Ecuadorian government. So that's, that's one part of the answer. So there's concerns there. And obviously parliamentarians in Canada noticed this and thought this wasn't right. And they're wondering, like, what the heck has happened here? So you can understand that. as I mentioned earlier, when I first started my little talk here, I mentioned how with Canada's endorsement of UNDRIP, our unconditional endorsement of UNDRIP, it means that we're not only, supposed to care about the rights, interests, and needs of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but those globally as well. We're still navigating what that means. We're still trying to figure out and navigate what FPIC means in Canada in terms of, consulting effectively with Indigenous peoples, and then adding on, having to consider that in a trade negotiation and whether Indigenous peoples in the other country has also been effectively engaged. This is a lot of responsibility for any government. And obviously we need to figure out how to do this better. I mean, I've got no answers here, but it's certainly an area of work or theory or academic research, but it does seem like something we should be working on. Ecuador is like the first example I've heard of this coming out. With our CUSMA negotiations upcoming, there may be an interest in the peoples in the US and Mexico to be more engaged than they were the last time around. So we've got to figure out what is the government's role, and how do we go about this? It's tough. It's going to be tough.
Thanks. Tane, last question or comment, and then I'm going to over to Don. There's more questions here. I'm sorry. I'm trying, in the interest of time, I'm trying to focus it to the conclusion. So Tane, please.
Sure, thanks. Look, I'm very mindful of the time and that we're past time actually, but shifting gears a little and maybe just giving another couple of practical examples of implementation. One in the negotiations, look, I see online, we've got one of our esteemed Māori intellectual property lawyers on the line, Linnell Tawhiri-Hudia. So we heard mention earlier on about IP, traditional knowledge, and Don mentioned market access. Market access is very important, and often prioritizing sectors of interest for Indigenous peoples is important. I won't give the full story, but in the EU FTA, we included a definition on Manuka honey as a Māori word and as a derivative from the Manuka tree that is grown in Aotearoa, New Zealand. You can find that in the Māori chapter. We included that because of the specific tariff line that was given to Manuka honey. And only Manuka that meets the New Zealand Ministry of Primary Industries definition gets that tariff-free treatment. That definition in that Māori chapter was done directly with Linnell and her colleague from the Manuka Charitable Trust. It's an example of the sort of the partnership. So the wording there was done exactly with Linnell and others online in real time in those negotiations. And just addressing the question in the chat from Sarah around practical examples of implementing Indigenous trade chapters, we've got numerous examples. The very first activity that was done last year under the EU and UK FTA Māori trade chapters was a Māori women-led science and tech and innovation delegation to Paris, Dublin, and London, coinciding with London Tech Week. And just recently, the UAE SEPA entered into force in late August, and just literally last week, the Māori Kiwi Fruit Growers Incorporated launched their product into the UAE, and that was supported by, with that incorporated group, Māori Kiwi Fruit Growers Incorporated, in partnership with New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Ministry of Primary Industries, New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, and other support in order to help them get into market. It was the very first activity, very first trade delegation, led under that particular SEPA. And just the cherry on top was that the Māori Queen, Te Araki Nui, Ngā Waihonui i Te Pō, attended as well. So just some practical examples of implementing these cooperation chapters.
Thanks, Danny. Don, you used to have the job of pushing ideas up to the minister's office to put some meat on the priorities as defined by the government. And as we all know, one of the priorities is trade diversification. If you were having such a meeting to sort of brainstorm on these ideas, what would be your pitch on integrating what we're talking about here into how that's relevant to what the government's trying to achieve trade-wise?
So tough job taking, what came out in this discussion and synthesizing it for a discussion with a minister, which is what an ADM does. There were so many interesting comments and so many issues. I'd like to spend, another hour and a half on, for each. But taking what I heard, I would make three arguments to the minister, and two of them are yours, and one of them is maybe mine, but I heard pieces of it here. So the first argument I would make is we should do this because it's the law. Because, in Canada, the Constitution Act, the duty to consult, in the UN system, UNDRIP, has been pointed out. So I guess, first and foremost, do it because we have a legal requirement to do it. The second argument I would make is it's the right thing to do. It's the ethical thing to do if you're a public servant. The name suggests you serve the public, and you do that with respect and with equity and with fairness, inclusively. So I think that's in the job description. And the third, I guess this is a little more mine, and I admit it, I'm an evil mercantilist. I spent 15 years as a trade negotiator. I'm sorry. But I would say it's good business. It's good for business. Indigenous businesses can contribute to trade diversification, which once again, we've been given an example of why having one big customer is a little risky. And so we need to diversify our trade, and Indigenous businesses can contribute. I think maybe at the moment, that's the strongest argument you can make to our minister and our government. But I think all of those arguments are sound. I'm hoping for a future where you don't have to make an argument, where it's just kind of automatic. It's just, another day at the office, business as usual. Our Prime Minister recently said that reconciliation is a generational project. I'm hoping it could be a little shorter than that, to genuinely integrate the interest of Indigenous people in our trade policy, in our trade programs, in our trade services, and in our trade agreements. Great discussion.
Thanks, Don. Thanks, everyone. I really want to thank our panelists and our authors, Cody, Tane, Mia, Georgina, Sherry. Lots of you are in the chat are asking about the paper itself. We're going to be sending, we have your emails. We're going to be sending you the link so that you can get the paper. This is just probably, hopefully, the end of the beginning of discussing these things, but I really appreciate everybody's input, all the time and effort that's gone into this. And have a great rest of day, everyone.